Looks like we're just about to get started. Jeff, how are you feeling?
Awesome. Sunil, this has been a long time coming for us to do this, so I'm excited to be able to participate with you and Prosperix on this. And this topic, you've chosen an amazing topic because it's something so relevant in the industry today. So yeah, doing great, man.
Appreciate that. We're going to just give another 30 seconds to a minute for folks to join. Very excited to have all of you here today and appreciate you spending the time with us. In a few minutes, we'll get into the topic, which is to MSP or not to MSP.
And that is
Nice.
the question, right?
It's always the question, and at
There's,
least it is on a number of people's minds, right?
well, and it's not always black and white. So I'm glad you've chosen this topic to talk about. It's very relevant, and a lot of people are talking and thinking about it, right?
Exactly.
So
And we're gonna take a little bit of a philosophical approach. We're gonna take a practical approach, a strategic approach, and just think through it, right, from all perspectives, and kind of cover these topics in detail. But I'm glad that you're here
that's
with me, Jeff, because you kind of see it from a number of different perspectives, and it's going to be fun to kind of think through it with you today.
yeah, and that's why I'm so excited about it. Is that idea of we're not trying to sell one angle or the other. We just want to
No.
be informative and talk to it. And quite honestly, as prospects, you're neutral to it, who's managing the program. And so it's just a great way to, introduce this from a neutral perspective and talk through some of the issues and some of the best practices and things you should think about. So it's been great working on this so far and prepping, and I'm excited to present it with you.
All right. Well, let's get started. And you're right about the fact that we're going to take a neutral approach. So the goal isn't to sway people one way or the other, but to help them understand the pros and cons, right? So today, obviously, my name is Sunil Bagai, CEO of Prosperix, and excited to be able to bring this webinar to you. Along with me is Jeff Nugent. Jeff is well known in the industry. He's with Global Contingent Workforce Management Strategist, and CW Strategies is his organization. You've probably seen a lot of his Ask the Expert type of recordings and videos that he posts, but just a wealth of information and a great friend. Jeff, thanks for being here with us today.
Thanks, Sunil. It's amazing. And, I've been in the industry I always do one of these, try not to reveal my age, but over 27 years now, going from starting in staffing to founding one of the first MSP VMS solutions out of Canada. And then, of course, a lot of people knew me from my employer of record days. So kind of coming from the whole idea of those perspectives, it's interesting because there's not a perfect right answer for it. It's based on the situation and the need. And we've had some discussions on this, and I'm glad you said, why don't we do a webinar on this? And so I'm excited to be here today.
But and the topic came up because we were both talking about what's relevant in the industry, and we're both seeing trends. We're both seeing organizations really look at their contingent workforce and figure out, hey, is the strategy that we've implemented the right one, and should we be doing something different? And so we're helping bring this conversation forward so we can weigh the options and look at it from a number of perspectives. And so with that, I just want to give a quick overview on Prosperix. For the folks that don't know us, we were founded in 2012. We are a total talent solutions company. We're a technology company. We have a number of products, and the core product that we have is an enterprise vendor management system. It's modern and it's innovative. It's fully featured. It's probably one of the best in the industry. Hopefully, at some point, you'll get a chance to take a look at it and utilize it. But what's really novel about our approach is that we have a hiring marketplace that is fully integrated with this vendor management system. So not only can organizations use the VMS, they can also procure talent through the marketplace along with their existing incumbent suppliers. They get access to an additional 4,000 suppliers to the marketplace. We also provide a lot of services to support organizations that have internal MSPs as well as MSPs themselves. We're partnering with MSPs on supporting organizations. We're focused globally. We're proud of the fact that Ardent Partners and SIA both have recognized us as a market leader and also an innovative VMS technology company. And finally, we're a certified MBE supplier. So with that, hopefully you have a little bit of an overview of our organization.
And Sunil, I'm just going to add, one of your biggest differentiations is you and the people that you have in your organization. It's run by really good people. So often that's overlooked and not put on the awards and other things, but that's why I'm here.
Appreciate that, Jeff. Thank you so much. We also keep good company. Just so you know, at the beginning, I want you to know we have created a guide for folks that have already determined that they are going to have an internal MSP. We put together a guide to help you get there, right? If this is something you're considering and you really want to build an internal MSP, we have put together a guide called Step-by-Step Guide to Building an Internal MSP. So that's the QR code. Just want to give you a heads up. If that's your decision, you've already made it, it's available to you as a resource and you can download that ebook, right? But let's get started. And Jeff, I always like to talk about challenges up front, right? What are the most common self-managed program challenges, right? What makes it difficult to manage a program yourself as an organization? And so these are the ones that basically we've heard about, people talk about. One of them is internal program team lacks strong leadership, vision, strategic capabilities, right? Another is the business case requires constant justification of value to obtain buy-in internally, right? Then program funding for it is complex or difficult to obtain or sustain. And by the way, it's going to seem like we're giving a preview of the whole webinar right here, but it's really to just tease and kind of showcase what are the main issues, and then we're going to go deeper into each of these, right? Slow or non-existent program adoption. It leads to missed program and savings goals that the organization may have had up front. They're not able to actually fulfill. The program requires a multifaceted shared services team to support. Sometimes organizations are not even aware that they need to have that, right? Business units have competing priorities, which makes it difficult to align on strategic initiatives. You're unable to deliver to committed program SLAs. And then finally, some of the other stuff that are more maybe tactical, but lack of visibility, reporting insights, rampant rogue spend with hiring teams going around the program. A lot of businesses think that, hey, we can solve that if we manage it ourselves. Reality is, it's just as much of an issue later, if you do it yourself versus somebody else. And then the final two, SOW spend still is not part of the program. And finally, talent shortages persist for certain skills. Jeff, what do you think of the list?
Yeah, and these are all very well documented issues that when thinking about this and trying to have it run it in-house, come up. And I kind of try to boil it down to a couple of big factors. And they're very evident in all these that have been listed. And it comes down to kind of, does your organization have the political will and dealing with the politics of having it run internally, and given the mandate internally to be successful and create adoption and overcome a bunch of these items? And does the company have the internal capabilities to run a program in-house versus looking outside? And when I get up towards that political will, you go, what do you mean by that? Well, typically, if you outsource a program, the total spend within the program, all of the billings, come into the spend thresholds. And so let's call it a $50 million spend is a small to mid-size. And they're, of course, much greater, some smaller. But that type of spend, a contract to be signed at a $50 million contract, that would go through an MSP, that generally goes up to the senior C-suite levels and even the CEO. And so when a CEO is signing off on something, they're also saying, how are we going to be successful at that, and monitoring it and asking for KPIs and giving the program some weight behind it, because you've got an escalation to the highest levels of the organization. So that really pushes that political will to be successful. So outsourcing often is a way to do it, versus internal, where it's potentially seen as a cost center that you're always going to be constantly fighting. And if the senior exec that's aligned with the program team doesn't have the power to convince the CEO that this is the idea, then you've got operations and IT and different organizations hierarchically fighting against the program team, and sometimes actually not allowing for success to happen. So in boiling it down to those two things, we've really saw all of those points within the objectives and challenges that hopefully, you resonate with the audience, and then thinking about when they're deciding to outsource it or keep it in-house.
Yep. And just so, to summarize, what you're saying is, at the end of the day, if you're thinking about bringing it in-house, you've got to have the right leadership and support, right? And if you don't, it's going to be an uphill battle. It's going to be a struggle, because you're going to have to constantly justify. And we're going to get a little bit more deeper into that, right? So one housekeeping item: if you have questions that you'd like to ask, and while we're going through the webinar, feel free to add them into the webinar on the Q&A option. And we're going to just jump right in, and we'll try to answer some of them along the way, and otherwise we'll try to save also some time at the end to answer those questions. So when we talk about whether you should think about using an internal MSP or an external MSP, there's 5 pillars for success that you should evaluate, right? That you need to at least have in mind. And so we've broken this down into 5 sections: strategic planning, funding the program, building the team, program adoption, and then finally measuring results, right? So if you do all of these and do them well, and you've considered everything, then I think you're probably ready to make that choice, right? But we're going to talk about, in each area, 3 or 4 or 5 things to consider. So there's a lot to cover, at least 20 to 25 items, and we're going to go through fairly fast. But the idea is to give you a comprehensive overview of the things to consider in terms of decision making, so you can make the best decision for yourself, right? So first, let's go into strategic planning. Start with the first one, which is clearly outline the business case and strategic objectives, right? And so I'll just jump in here to say what that means from our perspective is, you got to be clear. What are you trying to accomplish? Why are you trying to accomplish it, right? So for example, is cost savings your biggest initiative? Which a lot of these initiatives that happen about bringing something in-house and trying to manage it yourself is typically driven by cost, right? And so if that's true, then that is what the clear business objective and business case should be about, right? If it's something else, for example, other organizations want to control the brand, or they feel like, hey, we really want to make sure we can influence the culture of the workforce that we're developing. And so you have to articulate that upfront. What exactly are you trying to accomplish and why, right? Because if it's not clear, by the way, once you clarify that, then you can basically start to build a business case for it. You can start to then build all the requirements for that, right? But without it, you don't have a true north of what you're trying to accomplish. Jeff, what are your thoughts?
I totally agree, and often I've called them ROI drivers. Like, when you think about the success of your program and what you're going to measure against, you nailed it. What's your true north? What are you're going to look at measuring against as you've created success in the program? So what are you trying to accomplish here? So you've nailed it. Is it quality of talent? Is it speed to hire? Is it alignment with business? Is it streamlining processes? There's so many different potential, and they're going to be unique by the organization you're within. But defining those kind of key strategic objectives, that's going to flow into building that business case for you.
You got it. And it's core because if you're not clear about why you're doing it, it's not going to be successful usually, right? That's the challenge. And then once you do basically come back and say, here's what we're trying to do and why, right? Then you got to validate it. Because what you have to really understand is for this to be successful, there has to be adoption throughout the organization. And what that means is you're going to business stakeholders, whether it's the IT group, which usually are a big procurers of talent, finance group, sales, marketing, if you have manufacturing, et cetera. I mean, all the stakeholders that will utilize this service, right? And then you validate from their perspective, what are the program requirements? What do they need? What do they consider to be successful, right? Uh, and document it, right? Once you have that data, you document and you see if that truly is mapping to your business case and requirements that you've gathered, right?
Yeah, and
Jeff,
knowing
thoughts?
your current state, right? Understanding your current state of who's using the external talent, how they're using it, the workflows they're currently in their program. Understanding all of that is so important because this is also going to flow into your business case and align with your RO drivers, but also talk about, you know, the financials and commercials of it, of what you're trying to do. Is it cost savings? How much are you spending now? And doing some more investigation may be able to justify the business case because you can show a cost savings during the business case analysis, right? As well as, you
Absolutely.
know, or is there a risk issue to reduce risk? And this is why you're centralizing it, because there's different processes used for procuring different people and different policies, et cetera, that could potentially create risk for the organization around non-compliance with employment and tax laws and things like that. So, you know,
Absolutely.
knowing your current state, and I know we've got more down the road, but it'll help you define your future state too, right? And I know
Yep.
that's coming. So don't want to get
Yep.
too
So once you establish a business case, you start to gather requirements throughout the organization. It's also important to start building out champions, right? And partnerships with internal stakeholders, right? And if you get stakeholder buy-in, then they're with you, along with you throughout the journey. What you don't want to do is, do kind of the envisioning, the planning in a vacuum. Because when it comes to adoption, you want these stakeholders already bought into the plan so that they're ready to adopt, right? Otherwise, you're going to try to be, it's like pushing a piece of spaghetti, right? It's you're you're trying to get it pushed through, but it's not going to go anywhere, right? And so keep that in mind. Getting stakeholder buy-in is important along the way, especially at the beginning phases. The more you get folks involved, the easier it'll be down the road to get them to actually adopt the program later.
Yeah, and it's important to remember it's not only the users of the program to get buy-in and feedback from, it's the other stakeholders that you're going to need to coordinate with within the corporate functions that you'll need to get buy-in from to show how the program is going to make their life easier or help with some of those original objectives like reduce risk for the organization, streamline processes, help save cost, etc. And some of those corporate functions, I've often described them as catchers, right? And catchers is a weird term, but you'll hear me out on that. So typically, part of the adoption process that we'll talk about a little later on is identifying who's using what. And in some cases, even the users of the programs didn't know that they're using contingent workers. So having these catchers help identify like information security, people that need to either get access to a system or to a facility typically get provisioned through information security. And so if they're part of your like family of stakeholders and they're well versed on some of the policies, they'll help you identify who's using what where. The other is accounts payable. Accounts payable, when a vendor doesn't get their, or a contractor doesn't get their invoice paid, it's amazing how quickly they escalate and want to get paid. And if then they're identified to the program, then the discussion around the value of the program and how to get them paid through the program and how it's going to make their life easy or down the road starts to have those discussions. So knowing those catchers or those stakeholders within the corporate functions that can be your allies is really important.
Absolutely. And you're going to have many of them, right? So internally, sometimes this whole initiative is happening through procurement, or it could be happening through HR. Well, guess what? You're going to have to gain or build partnership across those different functions, a finance organization, IT organization, and this is where you got to work in tandem because this is a really corporate-wide initiative, right?
100%.
Then you start to think about, well, what does success look like for your program? You know, if you were to do this in-house, what does that look like? And you should be clear about that, right? Hey, in 2 years, in 1 year, we expect this, but in 2 to 3 to 4 years, we expect this, right? And the success can be KPIs, SLAs. Hey, we want to be able to hire in X period of time with this quality. We want to, 100% of suppliers to be going through the program. We want to drive, X% of cost savings to the program. We want to improve candidate experience by, this and so on. So you start to define it, and that becomes what you measure against eventually, right? But if you're not clear, not just about your business case, but also how you can, envision success, you won't be able to achieve it.
Yeah. And so you've nailed all that. I don't even need to comment, but it starts with those objectives, and then knowing those, then now you can start to see the future and then put in these ways to measure how you're moving towards those original objectives that you had identified.
Perfect. Right. And then we're on to how do you measure and report outcomes, right? Again, this is part of strategic planning, but you would think that this is going to happen at the end. We're going to have a section about measuring results later, but you have to plan for this up front because you need to understand when you have built a business case, you've gotten buy-in by key executives first, and then business units across the organization, your partners, your allies, your stakeholders. Every one of them has different requirements, right? So CFO is going to perhaps measure success differently than the IT department versus the finance department. And you're going to have to be able to report outcomes to each individual unit and stakeholders and executives differently. And so this is where the planning is essential, right? Finding out what they need and then being able to plan for that so you can build out those regular cadence of reports and provide that proactively for your program, hopefully even in real time using dashboards and so many other fun ways. But point is, if you plan for it, then you'll be able to provide it. And so that we're going to talk about measuring results later in a little bit more detail, but this is all part of strategic planning.
100%, 100%. And, once again, you may say, okay, I want the best quality talent, right? Or as one of my ROI drivers or those strategic objectives, or I want a cost savings. Starting as you're going down this path, understanding what that means and starting to say, these are how I'm going to measure those, what the metric of success is, and also understanding where that data is to be able to measure that success and report on that measure of success is so important, because you don't want to implement a program and then think of it later. You want to kind of start knowing where this data is and where it's going to be in order to be able to measure success, because measuring success and giving feedback to your users of the program that it's being successful and you're showing forward momentum and successful momentum to the success of the strategic objectives that they've bought into is a great way to continue adoption, continue to have that funding come your way, etc. right? So
Yep.
it's so important.
And so just one final note on measure and report outcomes is you're going to find that collectively there's probably 30, 40, 50 things that you need to measure, right? And there's a lot of data you have access to in a program. What you need to really figure out is what are the 2 or 3 essentials for each key executive stakeholder business unit, right? And those are the ones that what really matters to them and to you, to the overall organization from a measurement perspective. Get to those essentials because those are the ones that are going to be the most important, and you don't want to miss them.
Yeah, find those ones. You nailed it. Ones or twos. So is it, a time to hire and fill that seat? Is it, vacancies, right? If you can make sure you have low vacancies and you're bringing talent into the organization, so the CEO is saying, great, I've got all the people I need to fulfill on the work that we have to do for the business. It's essential. Is it a cost savings measure or customer satisfaction with the program as well? So really narrow it down. I know there's, like you said, there's so many, but narrow it down to those 2, 3, maybe max 4 or 5. That is a quick dashboard that your execs can go, yep, we're green, green, green. Awesome. Congratulations, program, right? And then they continue to be behind you when you go back and say, hey, I've got something new and innovative that I want to try in the program. And oh, by the way, I need budget for this, this, and this, right? It's so important. It's all tied together.
Yep. All right, now we're going to get to a really important topic and discussion, which is the funding of the program. And this can be either really easy or really challenging, right? And so part of the reason, this is a bit more complex and challenging when you manage internally is because you have to kind of watch how the money flows, right? When you outsource it, it's pretty straightforward, right? You have a bill rate and there's a percentage typically that is going to an MSP partner. But when it's internal, all of a sudden that may or may not be the case. And so we're going to talk and kind of peel all of that, all those layers, because you really have to plan this carefully, in my opinion. But we're going to start with just understanding the CFO's perspective, right? And the reason why that's important is because at the end of the day, the CFO is in charge of the overall budget for the organization. And from a CFO perspective, there are a lot of high level things that they're looking at. They're looking at either overall spend for the contingent workforce and seeing that number go up year over year and trying to find ways to, get that cost to be managed. They have their own cost savings initiatives that they care about. And what ends up happening is they see it either as a whole, like collective spend and all the fees are built in, MSP fees, VMS, staffing, everything is built in. Or some of them will say, no, I don't want just one number. I really want to see a breakdown of every line item of spend, where it's going. And then I have more levers to be able to control exactly how to optimize that spend, right? Not just in terms of overall staff and budget of people that we're hiring across the world, but also in the services we use to manage that, whether it's the VMS technology, whether it's the MSP, whether it's staffing suppliers and their contracts and so on. So it's a mindset that as soon as you bring it in-house, the level of scrutiny likely will go way higher. And the amount of data that you'll need to provide to a CFO to be able to justify a program is significant, right? And so just the key is be prepared, right? And understand that that is what the CFO is going to need.
Yeah, and it's important. You may be in HR or you may be in procurement and as a program lead and say, oh, well, I have to just sell it up into my vertical in my department. But they're having to sell it across the C-suite. And the CFO does have something to say about cost of the budget, internal budgets of spend on headcount and tools and that the organization is going to use. But a savvy CFO will also understand that this is a very important tool to manage the spend of the extended or external workforce, which is generally one of the largest single line items in the organization, right? And so a savvy CFO will say, oh, wow, this is a big spend here. What are we spending here to help manage that spend and potentially have an ROI from spending X amount of dollars here on a budget and tools to help save this amount of money or reduce this amount of risk, etc., to the overall organization. So putting into that perspective also helps strategically find budget or justify utilizing an external provider to manage a program for them. Because, you know, when we got into this industry, Sunil, back in 2008, 2009, when Contingent Workforce was really starting to take off and organizations were implementing VMSs and MSPs, the MSPs and the VMSs often sold it as a free of charge because, you know, the MSP fee or the VMS fee was going to be a vendor-funded model. You know, yes, they're sure, let's call it, and I'm a little cynical when I say sure, typically, that is a cost. And so when you really start to look at it, that percentage of MSP fee or VMS fee, when you multiply it across the total spend, tends to be a big amount of money, often, especially if you're looking at a big program. And so then you look at that versus then maybe what you would budget if you needed 10 internal headcount to run it, or 3 internal headcount, or 2, you may say, oh, well, let's look at it, right? And then that is justification for spending on those 3 internal people to run a program versus outsourcing it, right? But it all goes back to those strategic objectives and then strategically analyzing it. And the CFO that's savvy will start to think like this, and or if you're thinking like this and can present it to your CFO and your VP of HR or procurement, it really starts to resonate with them.
Yep. And honestly, I think that is really the catalyst usually, right? Which is, hey, we're paying for this service and we know the MSPs on a $100 million program is, you know, taking a few percentage points from that, right? And so from that perspective, they think, well, could we utilize the few $1 million to run things more effectively, more efficiently? Could we provide a better service and or save costs? That's really the option, right? Could we provide a better service or could we save costs, right? And then being able to build a business case. Again, it comes down to strategic objective. If it's to build a better service, then you may justify the investment and you have to show the CFO, hey, it's worth keeping this investment, but we'll do it more effectively and we'll deliver a better service, right? But if it's to save costs, then you can say, hey, we're spending X, we think we can get away with spending Y, and therefore, again, that becomes part of the justification. So CFO is looking at that with a lot more scrutiny, especially if it's in-house. Whereas if it's not in-house, kind of, I don't know, they're all, I'm not saying they're oblivious to it, but they're just seeing the top line dollar, right, that they're spending.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's look at external versus internal funding models, because you know, sometimes when you bring it in-house, you have options, but usually what ends up happening, and it all depends on the stage of the program you're at as well, right? If it's a brand new program, meaning like you've never had a program, then you can really do it whatever way you want, right? You can absorb you're basically having an internal budget for your team and an internal budget for your software, which is a VMS, and you get going and it's kind of easy that way, right? If you outsource this, now usually what ends up happening, it's either supplier funded, right? Or you add a MSP fee on top of what the supplier is paying. So it's an addition on top of the bill rate, or it becomes deducted from the bill rate. It's your choice. The organization pays for it no matter what, right? all of that is being paid for by the business, no matter what. How you slice and dice it is up to you. But there is a one key aspect to consider. If it's vendor funded, supplier funded, then what ends up happening is that amount, usually a lot of times the organization says, well, we're just going to use that internally to build our team, to manage our contingent workforce program. And if you do it that way, you're still collecting the fees from the suppliers and you're using that as your budget. And it's a fixed budget at that point, which then you're allocating internally. The difference on the internal model is that oftentimes, if it's not based on vendor funding, is now you have to have a budget that you're going to go and again build justification for with the CFO and get approval for to say, hey, I need 10 headcount to manage X, Y, Z, and therefore it's going to cost us this much. And we need that approval on an annual basis to be able to fund this program. Because internally you have to fund it versus bringing the money from vendors, for example, right? So that is a big consideration. And just how you set that up can have an effect over time. And we're going to talk about some of the pros and cons of this in a moment, but you got to be thoughtful in this one area alone, right?
Well, and it rings true kind of during economic uncertainty, right? That fixed cost, or I need 3 salaries to run this program, seems like a good idea when you're at a certain level already and you see the program growing, and instead of paying a percentage of spend to an external provider, you've got a fixed cost of the program just in those salaries that are running it. In economic downturn, you've got fixed costs sitting there, the 3 salaries, but maybe not the spend to justify it. And then you may need to make adjustments to that program team because budgets aren't being justified any longer. And that when you outsource it, that becomes the issue of the outsourced provider, where they're managing staffing levels with the ups and downs of the spend and the headcount and the economy. So it kind of rings true right now too that as cycles come and go, and they will,
Yep.
They will. I've been through 3 at least, that they come and go, and spend is high right now, and you think it's a great idea to in-house it, and then spend becomes low, and then you may have to cut back on your staff, and then that potentially costs and causes issues with customer satisfaction, ability to provide the program, etc. So you have to think about these things and make it resilient over time. And it may make more sense to have that variable cost versus an internal fixed cost.
Yep. So internal is typically fixed, especially if it's based on a certain budget that's allocated. External is variable, usually if it's supplier funded, right? So keep that in mind, fixed versus variable. That is a big consideration, and it can have an effect on how you manage the program over time, right? And so oftentimes, if it is a supplier funded model, you're basically utilizing the MSP fees to fund the program and drive cost savings, right? Because what you're hoping or expecting, or maybe even promising to your stakeholders is, hey, that we'll be able to take that MSP fee and whatever it is, we may reduce it by, a half a point or a point, 1 percentage point, and to be able to basically drive cost savings. And that's kind of usually a goal or a target or objective for some of these organizations, and it is a viable option, and it's sometimes easy to achieve and sometimes not so easy to achieve, and we're going to talk about that as we go into the next section, but just keep that in mind.
The only thing that I want to say on this is some of the most successful programs I've seen, they put in an MSP fee or a program fee similar to what an outsourced program would look like, right? And then they have their fixed cost of the 3 people they may, or the 4 people, or whatever that is, to run the program. And then anything they've collected in the 2.5% or whatever the percentage MSP VMS fee is in, that's covered the cost, they then send rebate checks back to their divisional users. and it becomes almost a celebration of success. So it's been interesting in some of those cases where, you know, they've driven success in the program, and then they've been able to say, hey, listen, if we outsource this, it would have been this cost, right? We kept it in-house, we collected what it would have externally cost, and we're rebating you back the money as the users of the program,
And
which
and
makes some of the
rebates.
execs happy, right? So it's good.
Yep. And I was just gonna say rebates can be one approach. You can always use that approach to give money back to the organization. CFO would love you if you do that. But the other is you can use those funds to invest in innovation and providing a better service. So it's really up to you. But usually what happens is, you use any savings to drive either rebates or future investments in the program. Now, Jeff touched on this a moment ago, which is retaining program funding during tough times, right? When the economy is good, usually that's not an issue. But when the economy is not so good and you have a fixed model, again, comes down to the scrutiny at the CFO level. Now they know every line item, every person that's allocated to this team. And guess what? I've seen this happen just in the last 1 year with different organizations, whether they have an MSP or not, even internally, they look at all team members and say, hey, do we want to be staffed at this level? Right. And so the challenge is when times are tough, budgets come down. If it's a variable cost that's based on spend, that automatically decreases. If it's a fixed cost based on internal budget allocation, then all of a sudden, when times are tough, that budget may be slashed or cut, and which means it can affect again, what you're able to deliver in your program.
Yeah, and we've seen that recently with economic cycles where there's a few more layoffs than we'd like. And
Yep.
I hope I'm still there.
Yep, you are.
Okay, great, because I don't see myself anymore, but that's fine. There's been more layoffs. We've seen people looking for jobs and things like that. And what organizations will look in tough times and they'll say, is this duplicative? And so if it's been run in procurement often, and they may see that there's already talent acquisition team in place that could take over the program, they'll cut one or the other, right? So
Agreed.
it's
Agreed.
those situations.
And Jeff, time check on your and my end. We have about 10, 15 more minutes to get through the other couple sections. So probably need to speed it up a little bit.
Yep.
And Michael asked a question about SOW spend and if that also is treated similarly when, why or why not, right? Does it differ, right? And Michael, if you don't mind, we're going to save that question for a little later, and just for the sake of time, and we will get to that. All right, let's go forward. So next is building the team, right? The third pillar is you got to consider what it takes to build a team, right? And this is a lot to consider because when you actually look at the MSP function and services, MSPs do a lot. It's, as much as we're always thinking, hard on them and thinking about, hey, what about this and what about this? The reality is when you start peeling it back, these organizations are well-oiled machines and have a lot of internal resources to do end-to-end workforce management, right? They're doing everything from job intake calls to curation of candidates to interview scheduling, onboarding, analytics team. In fact, they have shared services teams that are just doing things like analytics and supplier management, QBRs, compliance, audits, payments. I mean, it's fairly robust and a large teams of people to do this. So when you're thinking about bringing it in-house, what you got to think about is, what can you realistically duplicate? What can you actually staff up for? And what's essential? What's core? What's like the most essential that you want to be able to bring in-house versus perhaps, find an alternative to be able to support the rest of it, right?
Yeah, and just a quick one on this is it's not just the three people that you see on the program team and what their skill set is, and does that match to what the list is of the steps in the workflow process. You got to look behind the curtain what your MSPs and or MSPs do for you, like data analytics, innovation tools, things like that, looking forward that you are potentially missing out on because you don't have that capability or those strategic things that they can amortize or share between multiple programs. So it's important to also peel back the curtain and go, what else is my MSP doing or thinking or whatever that isn't seen just with the 3 program team members that are on site at my program, right?
You're so right, Jeff. I mean, at the end of the day, remember the MSP model is to amortize, like you said, shared services across many programs. That way they can bring the cost down. I've heard so many times MSPs say, and it depends. I mean, it depends on the size of the program, but some of them say they use the word loss leader, right? It's almost as if, the MSP services are at cost, or they're spending more sometimes than actually getting in return for delivering the services. So it's something to keep in mind that you will may or may not save money because you have to have all of these functions to be able to support your program, right? If you bring it in-house. So keep that in mind. It's another big area to consider, is will you be able to staff up in these areas, and how will you be able to do that, right? Another topic about building the team is, does the program need to be managed globally, right? And then again, do you have the resources to be able to do that effectively? Or in an MSP case, oftentimes that's really where they shine. They have team members all over the world, right? And so I don't think we need to spend a lot of time here. Jeff, do you
No,
have any
we
thoughts?
don't. And the only concept with this is you can always take a hybrid approach and potentially have an in-sourced program in certain jurisdictions and an outsourced program to within other jurisdictions where you say, it may be better, they have expertise, and I'll use an external third party in other jurisdictions. It doesn't have to be a one-size-fits-all situation. So just to kind of throw that out there too, I've seen a lot of programs, or at least some really successful ones, that have an MSP in certain jurisdictions, and they've said we'll manage it internally in others because it doesn't justify the scale of the program in that country, doesn't justify an MSP, or vice versa, where you're managing it internal somewhere and then you've outsourced the MSP that has the expertise in those jurisdictions to run a program more successfully than you could internally, right?
And you're bringing up a really important point, which is we're talking about it as if it's black or white, right? Meaning to be, to have an internal versus external. But there is a middle ground, right? There is a potential opportunity where you can do both, right? And it requires you to again be even more thoughtful about where it makes sense to potentially internally manage versus makes sense to have a partner supporting you in that journey, right? And so you can do it by geography, you can do it by skill set, you can do it by business units, you can do it by enough, you can slice and dice it in many different ways, right? And so again, I actually think that sometimes it's maybe not so clear cut. In some cases it is, but this is where you can perhaps talk through it with partners that can support you in making that decision. Shared services versus dedicated teams. We did touch on this a moment ago, but it's something to think about. Why this is important is because MSPs automatically have shared services team, and they have to because that's the way they can scale their MSP services, right? Which is an external MSP provider will have a shared analytics team because they don't perhaps need to have a dedicated analytics team per client. They can share that as a function across across multiple clients. Same thing with other functions like onboarding, payments, etc. Right?
Main one I often see where clients struggle when they bring the program in house is managing the VMS, right? And supporting the
That's
VMS.
another good one.
Is going to an MSP that has expertise that they've invested in, that are managing the multiple VMSs out there. When you bring it in house, you'll often turn to your VMS for support, and they'll say, well, actually your contract was with the MSP, so you're kind of on your own, or you got to do it this way. So that's something to really think about as part of the program is, my MSP, the MSPs have expertise. And I always say it behind the magic curtain, like the Wizard of Oz, they have a shared services to manage the updates to and support your VMSs and other things like you've mentioned.
Yep. And it's interesting, there are some VMSs that have been around for so many years, and I've when I talk to MSPs, often the MSPs have more of the VMS experts in their organizations than the VMSs themselves, right? which is saying something, right? So keep that in mind. The technical expertise is something you'll need, but also shared services for other functions, as we mentioned, finance, analytics. How are you going to build them? How are you going to staff them? And how do you build a dedicated team versus shared, and how do you make it cost effective? Now, some organizations will use offshore as a way to keep the costs manageable and have a shared services team of their own. So that is possible, but you got to think through this because it is hard when you're only providing this as a service for your organization versus potentially to multiple like MSPs currently do. All right. Another thing about building the team. This is one of my pet peeves. Oftentimes, there's a lot of great initiative early on, and organizations will hire for strategy. And then, once the program is running, they'll start to, staff up for execution. But what ends up happening over time is they forget about strategy, right? Or they have some holes on the execution. You got to have both. And the reason why is because the program isn't mature until it is mature, right? You don't meet your objectives fully for year 3, year 4, year 5 unless you have all team members still on focused on it, right? So you got to hire for both. Somebody's got to be thinking about and planning for the future while you're executing for today.
Yeah, and you've wrapped this up. I don't want to go too much. I know we're short for time, but it's so important. And quite honestly, the only thing that I would add would be I've seen in a lot of circumstances where organizations will go into a conversation with the MSPs to help them stand up the program and help them with the strategy to get it into a steady state, and then hand it back, the keys back, and then act as advisors, right? And so that
Absolutely.
so there's different ways to skin that cat. Or in some cases, what they've done is they thought they were going to have the MSP just help them stand up and take it in-house. And then they figured out it's more than just what they figured they could do, and they've kept the MSP going. So, thinking about this strategy about how working with an MSP to get you set up may be a way to help you accelerate your maturity of the program.
Yeah. And so that, keep in mind that considering whether you should bring it in-house or not often is a question of what stage you're at, right? What the maturity of your program is. There's 2 times to do it. One is early on when there's nothing, and later another time is when it's mature, right? Typically, those are the 2 times. And by the way, MSPs can be partners to help you get to your end goal. You can have an open conversation with them to support you in that process. In fact, I was speaking to one MSP, very large one, recently, and what they said is, hey, we're not just going in and trying to win business where we're managing. We're also, focused on being advisors. We're focused on providing them consulting so that they can do what they want and help them meet their objectives. So that is another possibility and something to consider. And by the way, when you build a team, you have an option. You can build your own internal team. You can still have a hybrid or outsource team. So even on the shared services, you can do both, right? And so this is an area where you say, hey, I need 5 core team members to do X, Y, and Z, and this is going to be my core team. But in these other areas, I want to leverage outsourced options, right? And so that's another thing is don't think that it has to be one way or the other. It really is flexible depending on the needs of your program. Anything to add, Jeff? We good?
I'm looking at the time, so I think you nailed it.
Okay, perfect. 2 sections. I don't think we're gonna get through them, but let's continue as much as we can, and then we can basically perhaps save the questions for later. Program adoption. First and foremost, obtain firm commitment from key stakeholders early on. If you get their buy-in, then you will also hopefully get their promise and commitment that they want to really adopt this program, right? If you get it up front, then you can hold them accountable to really adopt the program later on, right? I'm gonna breeze through these, Jeff, and then maybe you can comment after.
I think
Second
we
is,
talked about adoption quite a bit in the early stages and the strategy to help increase adoption. But if we were to breeze through these, get stakeholder buy-in, make sure you're constantly communicating with them, celebrating successes, etc. Right?
that's exactly it.
Those are
Train
some of
the
the key
organization
takeaways.
regularly, constantly, obtain feedback, create a loop so you can improve the program, iterate, look out
Customer
for.
success is something very important. So if you implement an NPS score or a customer feedback loop, that you're constantly getting that feedback and you're iterating and improving the program based on that feedback is so important.
Agreed. Look out for program leakage, rogue spend, and non-compliance. So this is about adoption too, because at some point, if you are implementing a program, what you have to really measure is how much of your organization is actually utilizing the program, right? And if your goal is 100%, meaning for SOW, for staff augmentation, for freelancing, for 1099, if you want all of those channels of hiring to go through your program, then you have to measure how much is going outside the program, right? And if the number is low adoption, high outside usage, that's a problem, right? That means the program's not working. And by the way, that's a key indicator of whether the program's successful or not. I mean, depending on how you measure success, but that usually is, right? And so this is really important to kind of watch for all the time. Any leakage, any rogue spend, any non-compliance, because frankly, that will help justify whether you continue to get funding for the program and keep it going or not, right? If it's high adoption, it's usually more cost savings, more success. Low adoption, that means that there's something wrong and you need to rethink the whole thing.
Yeah, and just very quickly on this, having a very clear definition of what's in scope of the program is so
Absolutely.
important. And then communicating it to your allied stakeholders, like we talked about, the catchers, specifically in AP, because measuring spend within the program versus outside the program, and they can help you with the definition. And then you'll say, oh, geez, it's low. We're actually getting very low adoption. The other point that I'll talk about rogue spend is if you have really stringent policies and you're not managing your SOW and your CW program has policies, you'll often see stuff that all of a sudden becomes statement of work, and all of a sudden this hourly based kind of consulting goes crazy in your statement of work. So having a very good definition where if it's hourly and it's not guaranteed service, it's not statement of work, it's got to go to the CW, that will help bring back some of that rogue spend, because often the statement of work areas is where a manager will throw it a definition as statement of work to avoid the program policies like
100%. Yep, 100%. And I'm going to probably just, stop here, which is reiterate the why and share results throughout the organization. We do have a section on measuring results, but that we can save perhaps for next time. And if somebody wants the presentation, you can always get it from us. I'll stop here because we only have a couple of minutes left. And Jeff, I want to thank you. And let's see, there's two questions. Michael asked one, and then Satish asked another. What are some of the major challenges while bringing on suppliers when it comes to in-house versus MSP programs? Supplier management, we really didn't get into. Do you have any thoughts on what challenges there are for internal?
Michael's question, yes, it's important when you're building an internal team and you're thinking about bringing in both SOW into your contingent program as well. So you're managing the contingent workers and more of that project-based guaranteed service spend. If you don't have the internal capabilities to manage SOW and speak SOW language, then you have to then change your strategy on how you bring SOW into it and let your managers manage the SOW, but you manage the data that within the program. So you still let it happen within the program, but you're not trying to get in front of the procurement of it. right? You're doing the billing, and then you have the data on the analytics on the back end to say, was that statement of work valuable versus doing it as a contingent program? So, you got to really make sure, because it is more sophisticated hiring statement of work type work and consultancy. So that's important. Satisha's question around challenges bringing on suppliers when it comes to in-house programs versus out-house programs. That's an interesting beast. Sometimes your in-house programs have a better relationship with managers, with suppliers and managers, and can create a better supplier management ecosystem. But in other cases, the MSP driven models can bring different suppliers and maybe more innovative suppliers to the table for you. So, there's a balance, and each program could be have its own unique needs, right? With that.
Agreed. Agreed. So Jeff, I think we're at the hour limit. I want to say thank you for spending time with me. And I also want to just reiterate that we have this ebook in case you are considering an internal program. We do have a step-by-step guide for building an internal MSP that I think you'll find useful, right? There's a lot to consider, and hopefully, we gave you a little bit of a glimpse of all the areas you should consider, right? From strategic to funding of the program to building the team to program adoption, and then finally measuring results, which we didn't get a chance to go into. But if you want the presentation deck, we can go through it, or feel free to reach out to Jeff and I. We'll be happy to support you. And Jeff, thank you for partnering with me on this. And hopefully folks find it very useful.
Sunil, thank you for inviting me. It's always awesome conversations with you. So I'm proud to be presenting with you. And please check out the guide. Prospects team and Sunil's done a really good job on outlining things to ponder as you're going down this journey.
Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Appreciate you guys attending.